Tale of Two Cities, how totally blanking on their names. The dude takes place of the love of his wife's husband and ends up dying for her to prove his love for her. And like, that's his final act. I would say that that's more of a tragedy because he's willing to let her be with the person she loves rather than like continually fighting for her day after day.
In general, though, I think whoever that ethicist was that I remember, because of the way he said tragedy, which was just terrific, is right that our movies end on a high note usually. Americans don't like tragedy. We want the bad guys to get it and the good guys to win.
Have any of you seen any German films? They have their own like Hollywood thing where they produce films, right? Most German movies do not end on a happy note like ours do. If you watch, because I had a German class and my teacher loved German movies, so. But like I think one is called the North Face, which is a famous mountain over there that like everybody who climbs it dies, and so they make a movie about it where this team goes up and naturally everybody dies and that's the end.
Cool.
They don't have a lot of movies with happy endings. They have movies that just kind of like end really abruptly, it would seem to me. I'm American, so it just seems abrupt to me. Or it would end tragic. And that's
Did you
much
join the
different.
military?
It's a different culture.
So there's, like, I think maybe off the top of my head, I can only think of one actual German-made movie that I've watched.
Still
It
running?
was on Netflix.
Yes.
It's called Schultz Finds the Blues.
Never heard of that.
That's a good movie.
It is a great movie, but
We're
it
talking
ends on a
about tragedy.
tragedy,
It
right?
does, but I feel like it's also well placed in all the time. Like Americans,
Yeah, well, yeah.
we don't like the tragedy. We don't want that. We want like the lovers to come
We
together.
like Disney movies.
But yeah, exactly. But in reality, we want that because we don't get that.
Well, did any of you, actually we had one recently, did any of you see Alien, I think it was Covenant that just came out?
Mm-hmm.
So, most of the Alien movies, Ripley ends up killing the alien or escaping it, and you know, happy ending relatively, everybody else died but she made it. In this one, well, you guys haven't seen it, I can't really spoil it.
I've seen it.
I don't
Well,
want to see it, so you can go
You can
ahead.
just say it.
Okay.
Let's do it.
The android ends up, because everybody thinks he's an ally until the end where he betrays everybody, and then he takes them, he locks them on the boat, and because he makes aliens. That's what he does. He actually makes them because he's a psychotic android. And but basically he ends up taking over the entire ship full of like some 60,000 people, and now they're his experiments to make alien babies pop out of them. So that's the end of that movie. And the whole time I'm like, yeah, that's so different. I love it because it's not a happy ending.
Yeah. See, but to me, like that doesn't even seem like a tragedy. To me, that's like, ooh, there's gonna be a second movie, and
Well, yeah,
I'm
it's
down.
just, it's just like the villain
Well,
won that time.
yeah.
Our villains never win. So
Yeah.
it's so cool.
Yeah, it's a prequel.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
which
ties everything.
First one was Prometheus, second one you have that
Yeah.
one.
yeah, but it's terrible, honestly, what it does to the series in that point. But I can see
It
now
does,
that
but
can be
that-
considered a tragedy.
I thought it was cool. That's the
I
problem.
mean, though, you know, developer, it just, I don't know.
You know.
Little,
But
little
it-
take, because
it was
they tell
actually
you
very
really how to determine
philosophical.
between the two, and then it's like the main characters ignore that fact.
And it,
Well,
yeah,
now that
because
they've had
of
this course, everything
you know,
you ever
God
see is
creates
going to be
man, man
philosophical.
creates, technology,
Really?
man destroys God, like that whole
Yeah.
circle.
Well,
Yeah.
think about what we've been arguing about, and the main thing that he feels tragedy is a purgation, a purging of the community that does several things. One, it reminds us, yes, that all these tragic consequences are part of being human. So we all will suffer these. Everybody dies. Everybody will lose family and loved ones, because of our mortality. All that happens, and none of it ever seems fair. I mean, it was a wonderful person. They did all these wonderful things, and they were doing so well, and then they were helping someone. They went out and helped some people cross the road, and a tractor trailer comes along and just boom, runs them up.
What do you learn in today?
Like the kid in the
Tyler?
snow machine.
Oh, I
Yeah, the
learned in
kid-
class today
yeah.
that everybody dies.
Well,
That's actually really funny you bring that up, though,
What
because
a
in
good
American
class.
films where that does happen, they're usually comedies.
yeah.
Actually, that's not true. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like they want to lighten the situation.
On a side note, did you know that you have to have a will for your tortoise because they live forever? Like they live longer than you?
Oh,
Yeah.
Funny.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
or different kinds of parrots. They live like 80 years.
I wanted to be cremated with me.
Poor Charlie.
You can serve it at my wake.
They didn't say what carnival, they just said you had to have one.
But so the idea is that by the community, and really these were like almost religious events for the Greeks. You had to be there. It wasn't like you could just say, oh, I'm not going, I don't like her, she's a terrible actress, you know, or whatever it was. You know, but no, you had to be there, and
Kind of a sign
It
of
was-
wealth. I mean, if you can't go, that means you don't have the money to go because you have to go
I
and
don't know
work
that they
or
had
take
to
care of
pay.
something.
it might not have
Well,
cost
I
money.
mean, just the leisure time. If you don't have the leisure time to go see that implies you don't have enough wealth to take time off of
That
whatever you're
that
doing.
could be. That
So
could
it
be.
might
Maybe
be-
it was only for the people that.
It might be a social standing kind of thing.
Yeah, could be.
Because I think
It
back in
sounded
the
like
day,
they
like
didn't do them at night. either.
feudal lords, they didn't have like a certain amount of like steak or something on their table. It implied they were
Certainly
poor,
would be
right?
different for the Romans,
Stuff
because
like that.
when you look at the kinds of arenas that the Romans built, they were much larger. You clearly couldn't just stand in the middle and speak. You know, they didn't have megaphones or anything back then. And the Greek ones, the way they're made, you could stand down at the stage area and speak, and your voice carries. They're made to carry your voice through the whole arena.
Actually, no, our modern like I don't know what they call it, opera houses, I guess.
Amphitheater?
They're built on Greek architecture to make because the way they built echoes the voice out. It's has something to do with like parabolas or something.
It's supposed to be absolutely fantastic, some of them. Ours is great. You could hear someone on our stage at the PAC at any of those three venues,
Yeah, sure.
and they could stand on the stage without a mic and talk, and you could hear them. On the other hand, when Cats, I remember going to Cats, and every one of the cast members had their own throat mic, and it was all on Wi-Fi, and the system was so screwed up the first act that it was like, you know, they were cutting one another off, you know, like, you know, in the middle of their singing. You know, and I was like, oh, geez, this is, you're better off listening or recording than being here. But they fixed it by the second act, so.
I spent a week in Sicily, and we went out to a Roman amphitheater, and it was right on the edge of a cliff. So you have into the cliff face all the seats and the road benches, and then like the back of the stage, and I mean like 10 feet off the back of the stage, straight drop down, beautiful blue ocean as far as the eye can see. It was amazing.
So if the audience was blown away there, that was the end of them.
Yeah.
But, so it's supposed to purge the community. So in other words, you know, we're all crying about this together, and it makes us feel like a united community, and that would be an important function of all of this, right? So it answers the tragic question about the nature of life. We're screwed. We're all screwed. Period. You know, and you know, but you know, there's nothing we can do about it, basically. So that's kind of a function of the tragedies, at least in that particular environment. But I don't know that. I mean, when we go to see a Star Wars movie at the end, we don't come out of the community feeling purged that, oh yes, we're all going to die and it's okay because it happens to everybody and it always has and there's nothing for it. No, we come out thinking, hey, I could live forever. The Force is with me. You know, I could be like Yoda and live 750. When 700 years you will look as good, you will not.
Unless you're talking about Rogue One.
That kind of was a tragedy. Now that I think about it.
You already knew the ending before going to it, though.
I didn't. I
can't
read
think of
it.
it ending any other way though. Now that I think about
Oh,
it.
it has to end that way.
Yeah, like she has no place anywhere else in stories.
Did you see that one?
I
They
think I've
all
seen
die
them
in the
all.
end.
Star Wars movie?
Because the thing blows up where she gets the message out.
She does the
that they
Pompeii
die.
thing. She kisses the guy. They both, boom, fire. You know, it's a Pompeii ending. That's what it was. It was Pompeii except Star Wars. That's
Yeah,
what
but
it
that
was.
minute and a half of Darth Vader at the end, I'm just saying, made it entirely worth it.
that was worth it. The Darth Vader's in it.
Fans
Go.
demanded
None of us
Yeah,
saw that.
the Star Wars movies, of course, you know, I'm addicted to those. All Although for me, the farce is with me, it's not the force.
So there's a question actually. Is it pretty much every other culture other than like American culture that really like kind of the tragic or more? Because I mean, like you have us Disney sat there and kind of bastardized like the Grimm fairy tales because those are pretty actually dark when you look at Cinderella. Like
Right.
siblings actually got their eyes pecked out by the birds for what they did, and then like Japan, like I've watched like traditional Japanese, not really like the more common movies tend to have kind of a sadder ending, but with a lot of meaning to it. So I don't know, is it just like America that we sit here and be like,
Like,
oh, we need to have like happy ending on?
Even the Grimm books, like, I think Barnes & Noble just published a new version of all the Grimm fairy tales. I bought it, but I can't read it because they're all basically happy endings still. I think they like re-changed them to be the modern American versions because
Then
I
it's
was
not
reading
really
them.
Grimm fairy tale then.
Most of them aren't like really that dark. I was like, okay, I want to read the dark versions of all the Disney crap. None of them were really that dark.
Well,
Like,
that,
Well, it's
that
'cause
ties
that was
into what
public
Kurt
domain.
Anderson talks about in Fantasyland. We kind of were founded by groups that were looking for that not the town on the, what's the line?
Grass that was greener?
The community on the hill, the heaven, little Edens all over the place. And that's kind of interesting. That would be a great topic to try to play with that, to see why Americans don't like tragedy. And I think it's spreading, because I know, like I'm thinking of the Kurosawa films. Those are the films that inspired a lot of our Westerns, actually. It went the other way, right? So like Seven Guns, how's it go?
Talking about a fistful of dollars.
Well, there was an American movie that was based on the Seven Samurai. That was like the seven.
yeah.
Magnificent Seven.
Oh,
Seven-
Magnificent Seven.
Magnificent Seven. Yeah. So I remember thinking when I saw the Japanese movies, oh, that's just like the American movies. It was actually reversed. So that was kind of interesting. But even so, Kurosawa would have, just the fact that there were films, there were already, Hollywood was really, parts of Europe, but Hollywood was already into making Americanized kinds of movies right from the get-go. So I don't know, where these cultural influences have their roots, maybe, what inspires them and how they spread. But I mean, the Bollywood movies are just as American as American movies, except that they've got a cast of Indian actors and actresses, and
Well, I mean, like for American Legend, we have it like what Paul Bunyan, Pico Bill, if I remember correctly,
Johnny Appleseed.
Johnny Appleseed.
David Crockett, right?
Well, David Crockett.
He was a real guy. But
Yeah.
He's also got.
Well, they
tons
do
of
die in the
Sensationalized.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they sent shit.
Yeah, and then I'm trying to remember the name of the guy that drove the railroad spikes.
Black guy, right?
John
Big-
Henry?
Yeah, well, that's how we remember him. Yeah, John. I think it's John Henry. What was the name of that film with?
I can't remember what it was.
It was such a good film. I can just remember the name of the actor. He died.
our finger tapping is being recorded, by the way.
I'm so sorry.
That's just funny.
So essentially, what you're pointing out is American-specific mythology, I guess.
Yeah,
We like our characters larger than life, untouchable.
basically. I mean, one guy broke tornadoes.
Yeah.
Well, even Candide, when I mentioned Bernstein's version of Voltaire's
Oh, Patrick Swayze. Patrick Swayze was in it.
was a comedy. I mean, there's still, things, everybody still dies. Oh, but, the stars all live, magically, survive. So in a sense, it's a comedy. And, whenever I hear, like, not glitter and be gay, which is obviously meant to be funny, but, like, how's it go? Here we go. build our house and make our garden grow. So this is at a church. That's interesting. Let's So this is hilarious. Notice no one in the audience laughs. These are two nobles that have no clue how to do any of the things they're talking about. Or they're idealizing how easy it would be to build a house and grow their own food, you know. How hard it is to chop wood. You know. So it's hilarious because these are like two frilly dressed, French nobles that have never lifted a tool in their life, and they're planning on planting, planting food crops, and they think that this will be like heaven, and they don't realize that.
Now is that based on Marie Antoinette? Because she had a cottage built
Voltaire?
on the the whole concept, because and maybe Voltaire is the time frame, because she built had a cottage built on the grounds of Versailles, like a peasant cottage, just so she could go with her ladies and see how the common people lived, and they would sit around and drink tea in this, and it was supposed to be like a poor person's cottage, and it was again one of those things that angered a lot of people.
That's cool. Well, Voltaire was same time as Rousseau. And I just learned the other day that wasn't really his name. That was one of he changed his name to Voltaire from Jean-Louis something or other.
Something French.
Yeah, that's funny how the French are like that. When does comedy? See, for Aristotle, you either had tragedy or comedy, and the basic definition of a tragedy is the main character, the hero, does everything right and gets screwed in the end. And it's not really his fault, although there's like some little fault somehow that will eventually lead to it. So Oedipus, doesn't know. The prediction is that he's going to kill his father and marry his mother, and let's get rid of him then. Of course, that get rid of him thing never works. He's end up raised by somebody else, and he ends up seeing his father coming along, and he kills his father because of a conflict between them. And he comes back to the village, and he ends up falling in love with his mother, who he doesn't realize is his mother because of course he was abandoned, etc. And then once he finally does realize, yes, that he's the one that's killed his father and is now married his mother, he plucks out his eyes, and that's so it's tragic because he's actually been a good hero all along, and yet all the horrible things that was predicted actually all come about. So it's fate, and we could tie Schopenhauer into this too, because remember Schopenhauer's point of view is basically that we're all screwed. It's the will of this universe basically that's going to screw us all, and there's nothing you can do about it. Even the gods get screwed. Everybody will be screwed by stuff. So he's so depressed.
But that's like not in the sense of the Oedipus complex and all that, but I mean, you can do literally everything right and everything will still go wrong, and I just think that Americans don't like that. Like we always search
Yeah.
for like the happy ending, or like that's our escape, whether it's in books or movies or TV shows or anything like that.
And they lived happily ever after. And the cute kid sitting in the bed listening to the nighttime story says, "And what happened after that, Daddy?" The happily ever after actually never actually happens, right? Because eventually somebody's going to get the flu and die of pneumonia or something, and your son's going to be doing great, and he gets run over by a tractor trailer trying to help somebody. Sorry, that one's in my mind. Because it sounds, what was he, 22, UAF student?
Yeah.
Ugh, boy, that Fairbanks is all mourning his loss. I'm sure the tractor trailer driver's like, his life is, he feels like his life is probably screwed now, because he's thinking if he were just slower or just paying more attention, or who knows how you feel. But the other kind of performance is a comedy, and the comedy is, in a sense, just the reverse, and that's where the main character, you wouldn't call him a hero. This is, I'm thinking of, the Pink Panther, Inspector Clouseau, kind of character, just gets everything wrong. Doesn't that happen in the National Lampoon's Family Vacation and things? He does everything wrong, but they arrive. Wow, we made good time, right? That kind of driving, falling asleep at the wheel, and he wakes up and they're parked at the motel, like that was where he was intending to go. It's just stupid stuff. But the end result of the skit is that it all comes out right. Inspector Clouseau does everything wrong, doesn't even know that the three different guys were trying to kill him, and all three of them are dead because of, they each killed one another. And he's not even aware that it was all happening around him, right? So that's what makes it funny, is that he doesn't do anything right, but it works out well in the end. And so in a sense, you could hold these up and say tragedy and comedy are kind of like mirror reverse of one another in some sort of very crystal clear ancient Greek kind of version. And so you have the happy masks or you have the sad masks. Which play is it going to be, right? We obviously, just mutilate this. In fact, I guess the perfect one, as an example of this, is the anti-play, which is Waiting for Godot, which breaks every single rule of a successful play and turns out to be a hit, right? So.
All
Right.
I'm thinking of is the producers now.
Oh, the producers, yeah, that's
exactly what
hilarious
happens.
too,
It's like
yeah.
they're trying to make a flop, and they end up making millions of dollars.
Which they can't, yeah.
don't want to.
Yeah, because now they owe all that money to all their sponsors, and they promised all the sponsors all the money, and there's way too many sponsors. So they were going to run off with all the money that they kept from all the sponsors. Yep, hilarious. Don't know if anything like that actually ever happened, but it sounds so realistic that in a way it sounds like it's the kind of thing that might have happened.
I mean, it might have. There's more than one movie on it, so it's possible.
Yeah. So, what kinds of so this has like been the focus of my thinking about today, is that Schopenhauer, in describing how art can literally display this kind of gut feeling that we experience in a way that nothing else will. Philosophy is too abstract. Art is the way to show it, right? Wittgenstein kind of interestingly says in his middle period, you might not call it that, but in between the philosophical investigations on the end point and the Tractatus in the beginning, he feels like the really important things that we want to say, we can't really say. We can't put it into language, but it can be shown. It seems like a Schopenhauer point that he's making there, that the real, you can't just say to someone, I love you, but when you hug them and give them a kiss, you get fired. No, I'm sorry, that's a, you know what I mean. When you want to express your feelings for someone, you can't just, you can say nice things. You could say, you're lovelier than a spring morning, or, no, I'm just.
Partially it might be related to, even cultures like more Oriental, which tend to not fill silence with words as much as like American Western cultures do. All cultures talk so much, and we're constantly talking, that's all we do. That might be lacking in communication for depth, because we communicate by talking, right? But at a certain point, that might not convey enough just because we use it so much.
What do you think of,
because it's so common, right?
Are you familiar with this this argument that there are other ways of knowing, that, for example, a native way of knowing through silence, really, just sitting there together without actually saying anything. For example, the anthropologist down in the Kenai Peninsula, Alan Boris, writes about a experience where he's coming back from a festival, not a potluck, but what do they call them? Where they're all sharing things.
Okay.
There's a name for it.
I think it is a potluck.
Well, it's kind of like a potluck, but there's another name for the native
Potlatch.
gathering. Potlatch.
Oh.
Yeah. So that might even come from that. Who knows? But in any case, he's driving these three elders back afterwards, and he's thinking, "Wow, this is going to be great. I'm going to be able to hear their conversation because they're all sitting together in the back of my car." And he's driving them home, and the whole time he's driving them home, they were absolutely quiet the whole time. They didn't say anything to one another. So in a sense, there's like this just being silent somehow communicates.
Well,
And
that actually has to deal with linguistics, especially English linguistics. So the interesting part is, like English, silence is either taken as you're either being rude or you're mad at someone when you think about it. Because, as you're saying, we tend to fill the void consistently.
right.
For me, I'm one of those people that, unless I got something really important to say, I'll just stay silent. I've had a few friends growing up where my neighbor Raymond, he would just come over, ring the doorbell, and I'd greet him. He'd come chill in my room. I'd sit on my computer. He'd be playing my PlayStation. Barely any words would be muttered, but I felt like it was good hanging out time. Or just driving with my friends, staying silent, just playing. And it's interesting because also in English, like when you're actually friends or familiar with someone, that you have more of that silence gap between you two, and it's still enjoyable instead of being seen as rude or mad at the other person when not speaking.
Well,
I would say I gotta agree completely. I think it's a sign of just being close, being content, being confident with who you are and who you're with. Whether it's a married couple, and I think a great example is maybe they talk about it in Pulp Fiction, where the one character's like, well, you can just hook up with somebody. Like you're on a level. I know exactly me. Me and my buddy drove across the country, and I think it was like 6 hours. We never said a word, but we had that level of closeness where we didn't need to.
well, I've been in faculty discussions where,
No one wants to stop talking.
well, what natives who are faculty members point out is that our tendency, even while we're listening to someone, is to be analyzing what they're saying. Thinking, what are your premises? What's your conclusion? Or do I agree with this? Do I agree? So that as soon as you're finished speaking, here comes my response, right, that I've already mapped out kind of ahead while you were talking. And the end result of that is that I'm not really listening to that person,
Mm.
right? That I'm
Yeah, that's
my mind is occupied with looking for their weaknesses. Where can I attack their position, instead of really immersing myself in
Well,
their.
for it to be true
their thought.
communication, though, there has to be an exchange of ideas. And if you're not analyzing what that person is saying, there's not an exchange of ideas. And then they need that positive reinforcement by your reply, and whether it's negative or positive or just simple like, yeah, okay, you know.
Yeah, and it was English-wise. I mean, most American Indian cultures, like, what is it? Most American Indian cultures, they responding quickish is actually considered very rude because they didn't actually. Most ideas that responded pretty quick are usually seen as hot-headed, or you didn't take the actual time to think about what you were saying. Even though in English, obviously, like, we'll perceive what someone says and think about it, but try to respond and still think about what we're saying as we're responding.
Mhm.
So, I mean,
American culture is also a lot more direct, because if you look at native tribes, which are Western, but I'm not going to include them in that. Sorry.
oh yeah, no, but
Western,
they're separate.
Western versus Oriental kind of cultures. Oriental tends to be way more subtle. So like if somebody is angry, like, I don't know, their roommate who's American was eating their snacks or something, they wouldn't exactly say that to them, hey, stop eating my stuff. They would, I don't know, not clean something or do something that would like express that, but they wouldn't directly say it. While American, if somebody was doing something you didn't like, you'd be like, hey, cut it out, man. And you'd be way more direct because we're just more direct with people. But like little stuff like that is really interesting to see how that interplays with
Well,
communication.
Where it plays a role, say, in the classroom, which is why it's brought up in faculty discussions, is that a lot of our students, they would argue, come from a culture where people don't talk as much and spend a lot of time just sitting there. And our kind of traditional Western way of even thinking about our students is that, if I bring up an issue, the folks that respond, they're the good students. The ones that are just sitting there and not saying anything are like, they're not the good students, right? And yet, if they're, say, native and thinking, from the cultural point of view, they're just listening. They're not framing questions. They're not being critical of what you're saying. They're just doing that traditional listening. And so at the end, they're not ready to ask questions. They're not ready to respond. And it's kind of interesting because I've had that experience where people will sit through the class, not look like they're really even paying attention, but afterwards come up as everyone else has kind of left, right? Then they'll come up and they'll ask a question or two about things that came up during the class. And I'm thinking to myself, why didn't you ask that? I mean, I won't say that, but why didn't you ask that at the appropriate time instead of waiting until after everyone's gone and asking it? And you can tell they're also shy about it. They're not, they don't have like a sense of enthusiasm. But now that enthusiasm is kind of a Western expectation, right? So in a sense, what I should be aware of is that a lot of my students are not going to behave the way, a Western traditional classroom environment with the brightest students being the ones that have the most to say. No, I'm misjudging. I'm using a Western bias that, they've actually been raised, perhaps, in a way that they shouldn't interrupt. They shouldn't say things. So I'm judging them as not understanding what's going on or not paying attention, and yet none of that's true. It's because I'm expecting behaviors that they're not evidencing, but that's because the cultural differences raised them so that they wouldn't do precisely what I'm looking and expecting students to do in a classroom. So I should learn about that and be aware of that so that I'm, understanding that people are learning in different ways. And my expectations should be different, and so on.
So we had to deal with this a lot in my previous job, working for the TSA, when you work out in bush communities. And what we found, or at least what we believe it is, it's more of a cultural issue of not wanting confrontation. And what we would find is we had a hard time training officers to have to tell people what to do, whether they were their subordinates or whether they were passengers. Hey, you have to take your shoes off. And part of it, and this is a running theory, and it's funny because we're doing a sexual assault thing. I'm doing a report for that in English, and there's a lot of the same things in the culture, because they had such tight confines, and this is our working theory, for so long, where the community has to stay together because it's a long winter and we're all staying in the same space. They would avoid conflict, and so there was a real problem of them saying, "Hey, you can't do that," or "You shouldn't do that." And so I see it as they're almost timid maybe when they enter a culture, like a westernized culture, where engagement is expected. Rhetoric going back and forth of ideas.
On top of that, it's even considered like in Western culture, when you don't necessarily speak, you're stupid. I mean, I got that when
Or
I was
rude.
in. Yeah, well, like I got that when I was in high school and seminar, because I'd sit there and listen, and people in the class, I guess, came to the conclusion I was stupid or something, because one of them made a kind of comment about it, because I just sat there during like our giant group discussions, because we put all the tables together and blocked for a period, so it was an hour and a half class instead of just normal 45 minutes, and I was just there and listen, and because like we had three, lack of a better term, chatty Cathys, like two of the guys, and two of the females it'd always be like four of them dominating. So it wasn't until like it completely diffused one of their points that, the respect was singing towards me and that I'm not just an idiot in class. But yeah, it's just kind of, it seems to be a
Well,
belief in
like
Western.
in those kinds of like Padilla seminar kind of sessions where you have an assigned reading, and then okay, now we're all going to sit around, and I'm not going to tell you what Schopenhauer said. I'm just going to, okay, so what do you think, right? There would be like two or three around the table that had lots to say and would carry the discussion, and you'd have three or four other people that would sit there, and all you could really figure was they didn't even read it because they didn't say anything, right? Of course, you're basing your judgment on the fact that they're not also ready to say stuff about it in that group situation. So it doesn't mean that they didn't read the article. It could be that they read the article, but they just don't like speaking, or didn't have anything special to say. They were just listening with everyone else. But yes, your judgment would be, gee, they didn't read it. They didn't have the.
There's also a really cool. It's just more about how the cultures differ based on where you're born. There's also a really cool interplay with authority. In America, our positions of authority, they're not quite so differential. So like if I have a boss, I'd refer to him by his first name normally, right? Like, oh, that's Joe, he's my boss, he's my manager, I work for Joe, right? And you might have a conversation with him, you might talk to him, and you don't feel that bad about expressing a complaint or saying something if something's wrong, right? But if you're in a different culture, it's a lot more, you can't talk to him. He's in a higher position than you. If you talk to him, you're screwed, don't do that. You're not on the same level, man, don't talk to him.
I was gonna say in the military, try calling your boss Joe.
Yeah, so the
different
military-
culture. See what that gets you.
The military is different, but I mean,
Yeah. No,
Well,
that's what I'm saying.
yeah,
That's a
and
separate
the boss
culture,
can't
separate
call you
culture.
Joe either. That would be wrong.
No, they're all Joes.
But yeah,
That's they're in the army.
It's always rank and last name, regardless of.
I mean,
Nobody gets "Hey you" treatment.
like in the
That's all.
American workforce, major, like, I guess, just normal companies and stuff. I mean, you might not want to do it to, like, a CEO or, like, top dog, but, like, your manager, you wouldn't feel bad about talking to, like, a normal person. A CEO may be different. We have a lot more of it has to be a really higher position for you to get that level of differential treatment.
Oh.
But in other cultures, it's like, if he's anywhere above you, he's out of your class. Sticks to your guys, which is
Especially
really
if you're like the
sensitive.
sergeant major.
We don't want to talk Sergeant Major, but no.
So
Well, more like,
I suppose you have something better to do than marching up and down the square.
But in that same right, I would argue that if you're raised by an older generation, like I was raised by parents who are older, and growing up, which I obviously didn't stick to, I was always raised the men are speaking, you don't speak while they're speaking. And so,
Unless you're male and she's female.
that was always
That was-
something, no, you're fine. That was always something where it was like in my house, if like my dad and my brother are talking, it's like you wait for a lull and then you say your piece. You can't just like interject. And so I would
think
argue
that's
that
definitely something that's been around for a long time. I kind of hope it's changing. I think it's changing a lot now,
I
especially with the younger
think, I
generation.
definitely think it's
but-
changing, but I do think that that's something that we have to think about, especially because there are a lot of people who have older parents of like the older generation, and that's how they were raised. And like going back to like what I said when we were talking about like the ancestry stuff, like my dad is the second generation from Germany, so that's also how he is, because that's how his parents raised him to be. You know, that's just like, that's how he raised me, because that's how he was raised. There hasn't been a whole bunch of, oh, look, everything's changing, because he wasn't exposed to this new way of thinking that's in America.
Here's a question. It's kind of a little bit off topic, so I hope you don't mind. But
It's still philosophy.
yeah. So recently, we've seen women become more and more involved in the workforce. They get higher positions. I mean, regardless of whatever wage gap or other stuff we're going to talk about, they are in more higher positions now. They're more included in the workforce. Now they're also paying child support in cases where the father gets custody of the children. Do you think that's fair? Just out of
Yeah.
curiosity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I was reading a bunch
If
of
the
articles,
mother-
and the women were
yeah.
outraged that they weren't paying, even though they had a job, and
Think about the
they were
drama.
paying child support. Yeah, I know, I can't wait. But like, I just think it's funny because we keep seeing. I like equality. I think it's good, and I just think it's funny when we hear people who really espouse equality, and they're like, except here. Let's not do it here because it just it.
It's funny, because that was like one of my quiz responses to him, was, I was like, equal but not equal.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, there is still a double standard, and I'm all for equality, but you can't sit there and, you know, have the cake and then not deal with the consequences.
I don't think we'll ever have true equality. I think it's just how
In
I
it
think
is.
that's
some
different.
contexts,
That's why,
it's
but I just
meaningless.
think-
Yeah.
I think on most things, the double standard's really funny to look at.
Yeah,
I was just wondering where
yeah,
you
we
guys
may
stand.
never have equality, but we should always have respect.
Yeah.
And I think that's just where people need to keep in mind themselves.
Speaking of which, the video, Martha Nussbaum,
Nussbaum.
yeah, I can only get
It
through
just
that.
means nut tree.
Hey, well, she is a nut tree.
Noose, well, noose is a nut and
Yeah.
baum is a tree, so.
Well, and it plays right into this because I think she's a hypocrite. And the reason I say that, because in the span of that video, she talks about modern philosophy and how, especially once professors are tenured in philosophy, they tend to write specifically for the elites within their own community and not for the average person.
Shouldn't they?
Right. Well, not exclusively. And that's her point. Like, if you're only writing to a handful of people, what is your... But that's the point I'm getting at. But earlier in the video, she talks about what she calls adoptive preferences, where people decide that if something's out of their reach, their social status or whatever, that they decide that they don't want that. And her example is women at home. And she says how they can even convince themselves of feelings of that they are, what's the word I'm looking for? That they're feeling fulfilled by being women in the workforce. So here she is dictating to somebody else what should make them feel good about them things. The whole thing seemed very...
Gross.
Yeah. I mean, here she is, you know, from this position as, well, I'm smart enough to tell you what should make you happy. You know, it's just, it seems very hypocritical.
Well, she does have at least one daughter who
Well, she mentions, like,
has
at
her
least,
PhD in
do you remember in what it's for?
animal,
She's an animal lawyer.
yeah.
They said it like 3 times. Which I'm like, yeah, well, that shows you right there.
But a lot of people actually do feel that way. Like there was a case in Australia where there were these two, I want to say like 19 or 20-year-old girls who like knew they did not want children. And everyone's like, oh, you're going to change your mind later, you're going to want to do this later. And like no doctors would, let's say, fix them so they couldn't have children because they were like, oh no, they're too young to make that decision. And it's like, you have older people telling you you're going to change your mind later. Like you need to like, keep this as an option because they don't want to accept that not every woman or not every like person in general doesn't want a family or doesn't want to have
Yeah,
that
I
kind
have
of fulfillment.
People tell me that today, like they ask me if I want kids, and I'm like, no, not really. They're like, oh, well, you're gonna change your mind. Like they're
Well, I think-
they're like, no, you are going to change
I
your
think
mind.
it's-
And I'm
they
just
feel
like,
like
well,
they
I
can-
don't want kids right now.
And they
I think
feel like
that's-
they can do that because
Yeah.
they feel superior to you in some way, whether it's
Yeah.
age or experience or education.
I honestly-
Because
think-
they got pregnant. They're like, oh yeah, I didn't want kids, but then I had a kid and I love it. It's like, okay.
I think
That's
they're not trying to be superior so much, and they might be, people are like that, but I think it's not so much as they're trying to tell you what to do, as in the whole reason the doctors wouldn't fix the women is because they didn't want them, because, you know, you can change your mind. They don't want you to make a decision while you're feeling this, that's
Yeah.
irrevocable. Once you're
Yeah.
fixed, you're fixed, there's no going back.
But that's not
So,
their
I mean-
position to
No,
make that.
No, I think doctors, if
It's-
they're
it's
being
not their
paid
choice,
for
but
that, they
also-
should do it. I just think they're also, I think it was slightly fair of them to be like, hey, I don't want to do this. They already refused to do that.
It's
So,
fair for
I
the
don't
doctor.
think-
I think it's fair for the doctors to say, you know, I don't feel comfortable doing this.
Yeah.
But for the doctor to flat out just be like, no, you can't do this, which is what happened. Like they told the girls they can't do it. It's not that like they shouldn't do it. And it wasn't even like an option of, well, you can always freeze your eggs that way later on if you do, they still have that option. It was just a flat out no situation. And it's okay if like they don't feel
Was it a
comfortable with that.
legal issue too? 'Cause
No, it
sometimes,
wasn't.
yeah,
It
the-
wasn't. At least like from what I was reading, it wasn't. But and that's fine for the doctors. But to just flat out tell someone their choice of their body, no, rather than bringing up, well, you can always freeze your eggs, and then you know that's an option you can have later on, and then like telling you how much that's going to cost and everything about that. That would be fine. But that's not what happened. And that's kind of like relating back to what you were talking about with the chick.
Yeah.
It's just like you're forcing your beliefs down someone's throat of their own body and what they want.
I do think, I'm not,
Liberal tendency.
I'm not espousing that we should control people. I think there's a certain amount of that necessary in a society for it to function, but